Hello, bonjour, and welcome to the Don't Waste Water podcast. I'm your host, Antoine Walter, and in today's episode, I am thrilled to welcome Sebastien MOURET as my guest. Sebastien is Europe and CIS editor at Global Water Intelligence, the leading publisher and events organizer serving the international water industry. In this very special episode, we made a 360 round view of the VEOLIA attempt to acquire SUEZ, which could or could not be closing today. Thanks to Sebastian's expertise, we addressed how the two last months might have reshaped the water industry as we know it, how SUEZ and VEOLIA quarrel from press release to media appearance, and why you should not believe all of their assertions. Sebastien expressed his doubts SUEZ might be able to bring a white knight into play, and he questioned the merger's ability to create a more vigorous champion at all. Meridiam's role, hypothetical synergies, shareholder cajoling, or unions entering a game that was thoughtfully prepared by VEOLIA are just some of the many other topics addressed in this incredibly dense episode. Let's wait no more, we start right after this.
You're listening to Don't Waste Water, the podcast that helps water professionals to improve their wastewater treatment, optimize their operation costs, and keep up with the latest market trends. This podcast is brought to you by GF Piping Systems. As a leading supplier of piping systems made of plastics and metal, GF Piping Systems is the global expert for the safe and reliable transportation of water, chemicals, and gas. For more information, visit gfps.com.
Hi, Sebastien. Welcome to the show. Thanks for accepting the invitation, actually. Let me just start by a physical consideration. Where are you sitting right now?
Hi, Antoine. Well, I'm very glad to be on the show. I'm in my dining room in Oxford.
So you have this nice little UK accent, which I'm lacking, but both of us might have some rest of that French accent. So we're going to try to be understandable for the 100 people, and I'm sure it's going to be better on your side than on mine.
We always try to do our best.
So Sebastien, I'm extremely glad to have you on that show because actually almost all my guests so far have cited your company as their go-to when they are looking for information because you are working for Global Water Intelligence. I am myself a fan of GWI, so that's why I'm so verbose at the beginning, because I'm really happy to have you on the show. But for the people that might be still, I don't know, living in the desert or on the moon, can you pitch Global Water Intelligence?
Of course, Global Water Intelligence is a leading source of kind of business information about the water market on a global scale. So we don't cover only one region of the world. We try to cover every single region, and that manifests itself in three main kind of outputs from us. The first one historically is GWI Magazine, which is a monthly magazine that does kind of a roundup of the biggest business news and analysis of the latest trends from around the world, again, in the water market, quite specifically. And then we also have a website called Water Data, which is essentially a strategy validation tool. So the idea is that I like to think of it as an encyclopedia of water, essentially. It can tell you how each bit of the water market works, who the main actors are, what the dynamics are, how to access it, and also how it all fits together, between countries, between different technologies, end user markets when you're talking about industrial water treatment. All of this supported by a really massive array of metrics and various databases that are all integrated into this one tool. And finally, not so big of a part, not such a big part of what we do right at the moment, but it's events. So not so much this year again, but normally we organize several events a year, culminating in the Global Water Summit, which is the biggest water event out there. It was supposed to happen in the spring of this year in Madrid. It's been postponed to May 2021, still in Madrid. And I certainly hope to see you and all of your listeners there.
So that was the pitch of the company itself. But now I have another question. Let's say I'm asking for a friend. How does one become an editor for a GWI magazine? And of course, as well, for water data.
Right. So just a note on that is that our content team is completely integrated. We have some people who do research for water data specifically, but everyone who works on the magazine also works on water data. Because obviously, the job on the magazine is to kind of cover the latest developments, and we want to have those latest developments reflected in our kind of slightly more static coverage on water data to keep it still up to date with what's going on. And in terms of background, I mean, there's quite a great variety of profiles in the GWI content, which makes it an actually great place to work at. So most people come, I would say, from a writing background. That's my case, for instance. But we also have data scientists and people who studied STEM subjects, for example, some of whom work on our tech coverage. And the company isn't exactly small in absolute terms. We have, I think, around 70 people all told. But compared to all the work that we get done, it is not that big. And so there's plenty of opportunity to rise through the ranks fairly quickly.
So actually, is your writing background your secret sauce, or would you say there's something else?
I would say actually the biggest strength that we have at GWI is the fact that we cover the water market comprehensively. So we aim to cover absolutely all aspects. And so that's, in geographic terms. So for example, I'm the Europe editor, so I focus on Europe and then a bit of Central Asia. We have other regional editors that look at various regions around the world. But we also have people who look at some specific kinds of technologies or some specific industrial end users across all geographies. And so by just talking to my colleagues, I can have a much deeper understanding of the blind spots that I might have. And so because we are looking at the water market in this very comprehensive way, each detailed piece of coverage is that much more informed and that much more insightful.
Actually, this deep knowledge of the sector and this insightful aspect is exactly the reason why I wanted to have this discussion with you today, and that's going to be my not so smooth transition to the deep dive. But, the news just crashed kind of the schedule of this podcast. And usually I'm recording things weeks in advance and lets me much time to edit. So this one, which is in the ear of our listeners right now, is going to be a challenge on the technical end. But there's a good reason for that. It's that we are leaving a drama, which is not happening every day in the water industry. And that drama is the number one in the world, which might acquire the number two in the world, namely VEOLIA would be buying SUEZ. And that went pretty fast when you look at it, because just 2 months ago, ENGIE, which is owning this 30% shares in SUEZ, said that they might be considering selling that. So they might be considering keeping it, but also selling it. 1 month later, VEOLIA just comes out of the wood and say, guys, we're going to invest 3 billion and we're going to buy this out. And today, which is the day of release of this episode, we are the 30th of September, which is supposed to be the day where ENGIE has to take a decision, because that's the ultimatum from VEOLIA. And we're going to see in the next minutes that there might be amendments to that. But right from the beginning, how is it possible that the number one in the world could be buying the number two in the world, and that this full decision process takes only 2 months?
First of all, just to be clear for our listeners, we're recording on the 28th, so there might be
much might happen in the next 2 days. You're right.
and the time it goes out, there might be new developments again. But yes, it is very fast-paced. I think what's important to bear in mind, just from what you were saying about ENGIE's position in all this, is that at the start of July, they mentioned in relatively vague terms their kind of reorientation, and that might include divesting from SUEZ. But at the very end of July, they made it much clearer that they were looking to sell the SUEZ shares. And this is important for what follows. And I mean, I'm sure we'll get into this later as well, but it means that one of Veolia's strengths at the moment is that then there's no alternative offer. And so that means that they have managed to be kind of at the top. But so to get back to the timing, it is very quick, but you have to bear in mind that Veolia has been thinking about this for a very long time. And then within Veolia, Antoine Frérot in particular, in 2012 already, there were informal talks between the two companies, which at the time were actually initiated by SUEZ to consider a merger, and that collapsed largely because of competition issues. But, obviously, this didn't disappear out from Frérot's memory since he was already CEO then. He's been CEO of Veolia since 2009. And so he has had SUEZ in his sights for a very long time. And when NG started making noises towards maybe selling their stake in SUEZ, he jumped on the opportunity. But there had been, I think, a lot of preparation beforehand. And I think you can see that in the level of detail that Veolia went into from the get-go. I mean, it's extremely rare in a kind of M&A attempt like this for the prospective buyer to come out with a 10 or 12 slide PowerPoint detailing exactly what they want to do, what they want to sell, what they want to keep, how much they want to invest, how much they want to kind of save in the long term, etc. So clearly there had been a lot of preparation, and including on the angle that Veolia knew very well the questions that this would raise, particularly with the French government, and sought to answer those questions immediately before they were even asked, and notably on the competition front. So on that sense, the 2 months are just the tip of the iceberg. But in terms of the initial transaction as well, fast is kind of the point from Veolia's point of view. I mean, Antoine Frérot's strategy is clearly to outrun SUEZ in terms of preparation so that no one is able to put together a counter offer in time. And you can see that in the fact that he has been refusing adamantly to push his deadline. So that his offer, as you mentioned earlier, expires at midnight on the 30th of September. And he has been pushed by many actors, by SUEZ, by the government, to push that back by at least a few weeks. And he has systematically refused to do it, to the point that on Saturday, the economy minister of France tried to get the leaders of SUEZ and the leaders of Veolia all around the same table at the ministry to kind of hash this out. And Antoine Frérot simply refused to come because he said that, the agenda of the meeting was just to push back the deadline, and he was refusing even to discuss it.
The fact that they were very nicely prepared, and I also read that they had a very busy summer, actually, because they were actively preparing the financial side and also all the reaction by advance to all kind of objections. So it was very well prepared, but that has also a consequence on the price, because the offer today from Veolia on the table is for this 30% of SUEZ, so the 29.9%, is at 3 billion, which would value the full SUEZ at 10 billion. And it is said that Engie would expect 20% more. But how can they expect 20% more if there is only one buyer? Is there any chance that it goes higher, that there's kind of overbid? Or do you think that's the right price for SUEZ?
Well, before we get to what I think, in the last few days, Veolia has actually agreed to up their offer in terms of price, because I think it was on the 17th of September, the board of Engie published a press release saying, we are rejecting the offer from Veolia at this price, but we're open to having new talks on another price. And so Antoine Frérot has said that he would present a revised offer with a higher price. He didn't say how much higher, but he said higher at some point between now and basically the time that this podcast goes out. And so we have yet to see exactly how much he will be offering. There have been very consistent reports that Engie is looking for 17 euros per share compared to Veolia's initial offer, which was 15.5 euros per share.
So 10% more.
Yeah, certainly 17 euros per share is what SUEZ was working towards in mounting a counter offer. Now, I'm sure we'll mention this later, but so far they seem to have failed in mounting a counter offer. So it all depends. In terms of what I think, I think that SUEZ's leadership made a fairly good point in saying that it was undervaluing the company, because 15.5 euros per share is higher than the current valuation on the stock market, but that is after the massive negative impact that the COVID pandemic has had on the stock price. And if you look at the February stock price, it went as high up as 16 euros. If you look at a 17 euro per share, that would put the total value of the company at somewhere around 11.5 billion euros. In one of his columns, GWI's publisher, Christopher Gasson, thought that a private equity buyer could potentially offer up to 20 euros per share, which would put the value at almost 13.5 billion. But that possibility remains, fairly remote and theoretical at this stage. It very much depends on who's willing to buy, is the thing. Clearly, NG is not happy with 15.5. Veolia is revising their offer. We'll see. I think given the current state of negotiations, 17 euros per share is a likely outcome in terms of compromise between NG and Veolia.
So that brings me to a question of the valuation of SUEZ. With the today deal, that would be 10 billion. If it goes 10% up, it's 11 million and maybe 12 or 13, depending on who might be the one to raise the share. But if you compare it, and I know I'm comparing peers with potatoes, but for the stupid like me, when I see that there is a potential deal between Oracle and TikTok to value TikTok to 60 billion, TikTok doesn't have any assets. It's just people on the social media app. So really, I'm comparing peers with potatoes, and sorry for that. But when you see on the other end that the number 2 in the world of water and waste management has this valuation of 12 billions, it's 20% of TikTok. Does that make sense? And why is there such a gap between this industry and the social media industry?
If I wanted to be a bit nitpicky, I would point out that the 60 billion figure is in dollars and the 12 billion is in euros. But okay, that doesn't change the order of magnitude. You're right. I think the discrepancy here has much more to do with something that's kind of intrinsic to the tech sector, where you have kind of crazy valuations over a very thin, not only asset base, but even a very thin revenue base. If you look at, Facebook, when they first made their IPO, they had hardly any revenue at all, and they were immediately valued in the billions. I think it's something that's much more to do with the tech sector specifically, rather than with anything to do with SUEZ or even with water. If you compare SUEZ with another kind of big global industrial group like Peugeot Citroën in automotive, for example, I just checked earlier today the market valuation of Peugeot Citroën. It's something like 14 billion euros. So it's very much the same order of magnitude. So yeah, again, I think TikTok, you have to look at that with a tech lens rather than trying to compare that to really any other sector, not just water.
So tech is out of this word, and the other sectors have more the feet on the ground. Makes sense.
Yeah.
But actually, if you look at this coronavirus times, where all the various countries are building some stimulus plans just to relaunch the economy, and I'm not talking of second wave or whatever, but all of that is always has to do with circular economy, with bringing back this aspect, the focus on environmental services and all of that. And SUEZ and Veolia are exactly at the heart of it, in the eye of the hurricane, actually. And shouldn't that help SUEZ to find a white knight that would say, hey, that's the opportunity. I can be the one that helps them to get this 30% share and to build something bigger. Why is it so difficult for SUEZ to prepare a second offer to submit to NG?
So this is a bit of a tricky one. Starting with the economic packages and the focus on the green economy and circular economy, etc., that is going to be favorable to the water and waste sectors as a whole. It's not singling out SUEZ specifically. Everyone in the sector is going to benefit from it. So in a kind of SUEZ versus Veolia perspective, it's not really to any one player's advantage. It's just kind of the tide, raising all boats kind of thing. In terms of the difficulties that SUEZ has found, it's hard to know for sure, of course, because this is all being negotiated behind closed doors. But judging from what I've read and heard, it seems that there's kind of two major problems here. First of all, is that there's not that much kind of private equity floating around in France. There aren't very many kind of big private equity funds that are French, and the fact that the project should be a majority French project is very much a sine qua non condition for the French government. So there's that. And then the ones that you have, well, one of them is MOURET, who, of course, is very much on the VEOLIA side of this whole thing because they are lined up to buy SUEZ Water France if VEOLIA is successful in buying SUEZ as a whole. So they're kind of out of the equation for SUEZ, obviously. And then another one is Ardian, which is the largest one that we have in France, really. And SUEZ did talk to them, but they have refused to commit. And Antin is another one, a smaller one, which was in quite advanced talks with SUEZ, actually up to very recently. But then on Wednesday, I believe, they pulled out of the talk. And that's incidentally when, or perhaps not coincidentally, the board of SUEZ pulled out of their hats this little foundation maneuver that I'm sure we'll touch upon later. But basically, one of the likely reasons why all of these investment funds prefer not to commit themselves to SUEZ is that they don't want to take sides, especially in a context where the government's position is kind of ambiguous. Because, France is a very important country. It's a very big economic power, but it's the economic circles at the top are a very small world, and you don't really want to be on the wrong side of the government, so to speak.
To upset someone or,
Yeah, in terms of future deals. And because the very first voice that we heard from the government in this whole thing was the Prime Minister, who I think very hastily answered the question from a journalist by saying, oh yes, this VEOLIA's project makes sense. It's a very good project. You need to protect jobs, etc. But Mr. Frérot has told me that he will protect all jobs. So, as far as I'm concerned, it's all fine. Obviously, that position has been very heavily qualified by the economy minister, who has kind of taken over the lead on this topic since, and he has imposed a much more neutral line. But the impression from those initial comments was very strong. And so there is this sentiment in Paris that the government is more or less on VEOLIA's side. And so if you're one of the few major investment funds, you don't really want to be on what looks like the losing side of this battle.
So actually, let's dive a bit on this political aspect. You mentioned at the very beginning that VEOLIA had very well prepared their communication and the way they packaged the offer. And it sounds to me like the Prime Minister maybe trusted a bit blindly what was said by VEOLIA. So if you read the first communications of VEOLIA explaining that if they don't do that move, well, the Chinese might do the move, or some US investment funds might be doing that move. And that it's a way to reinforce the industrial strength of France to create a French champion. Well, that's appealing to a politician, and that's appealing also to a French patriot of any kind of sort, I guess. And then if you fact check that, which is a little bit what happened after, well, you go to a more neutral position. And that's also a bit what came out of the auditions that happened last week. So do you think that the missing element was this fact checking, and that now politicians try to balance that out and to see, okay, what's myth and what's reality?
I think there's a bit of that. I mean, certainly, Antoine Frérot is a very skilled operator in this world, and he made sure to take the initiative in talking to all the right people and presenting his project to all the right people in person so that they would hear it from him and that they would hear it first before, they had time to hear kind of all the counter arguments, which, to be honest, SUEZ was a bit slow in putting out there. I mean, they were very, very silent for the first few days of this, while VEOLIA was going on media frenzy. I mean, I don't think there's been a single week since the initial announcement where Antoine Frérot was on television less than twice. He's been on television a lot in France over the past few weeks, whereas SUEZ has kept very silent because, of course, they're kind of on the back foot. They're forced into a reactive position. And so in terms of this whole talk of a great national champion fending off the Chinese threat. Let's deal with the whole Chinese thing, first of all. It's a bit of a scarecrow, isn't it? I mean, I think scarecrow, like Chinese scarecrow, is actually the term that Bertrand Camus used during the parliamentary hearing, certainly in the water market. I've noticed that the concrete examples, very few concrete examples that Antoine Frérot took to kind of substantiate his talk about Chinese competition were all in the waste sector, not really in the water sector. So maybe in the waste sector, it's much more real. That I'm not sure of. But in the water sector, it's really not comparable because, I mean, you have very big operator groups inside China, but they're very big because they operate, one or two cities that each have more than 1 million people. So it's a question of population density, for one. And they're not that active internationally. And then you have a few EPC contractors that are starting to offer some steeper competition for, building desal plants in the Middle East and all that sort of thing. But there is no company in the world from anywhere really that has the breadth of offering that Veolia and SUEZ both have. There's no other company in the world that builds its own technology and builds the plant from the ground up and can operate it and can take over concessions, etc., and do all of that in one single company. That doesn't exist. It's only Veolia and SUEZ, really. And then SOR to a lesser extent, because they're only really starting to that kind of technology arm together with the acquisition of Minehouse. Mm-hmm. So the threat of competition from China or anywhere really on Veolia and SUEZ is not that big to start with. And then the idea that doubling in size would be the answer really doesn't make much sense. It's the kind of strategy that makes sense when you're talking about manufacturing. Airbus is a great example of that, where all of the aircraft manufacturers in Europe all became one, and then you have a manufacturer that can export to the entire world. That makes sense. In the service industry, which is what we're talking about, it doesn't really add up, because what you end up with is half of the number of bids that you could make with two people, and so half the chances of winning one. And that's just kind of the mathematics of it. But if you look at the political and almost the psychological aspect of it, having one kind of massive juggernaut bearing the French standard and going all around the world to export French technology, that sounds fantastic in Paris. But if you're in any other country, what you see is this kind of massive armada of foreigners, essentially. And it doesn't really matter that they're French rather than American or Chinese or anything else. They're foreigners just the same. And, if instead of two foreigners fighting it out and trying to outbid each other, you have a single foreigner coming and kind of dictating its terms, that doesn't look great from the client's point of view, does it? And so it could very well put fuel on the already growing fire of opposition to private operation of water altogether.
So that means that the French super champion is a counterintuitive bad idea. I mean, as you said, seen from Paris sounds great, but because of the specificity of that market, it doesn't really make sense, or it doesn't make more sense than what the two groups are already doing today. I think I've read that on one of your papers, that there's no contract today that each of them cannot serve from the beginning to the end. So if the both of them combine, it doesn't change much.
Certainly, there's no contract that they're too small to bid for.
Exactly, yeah.
There are contracts that they're losing, obviously.
Yep.
But it's not because they're too small, because no one else is bigger than they are.
So that was for the fact-checking of the first wave of arguments from Veolia. But now, if you are coming back to the French politicians, I don't know how much power they have actually. But coming back to what they are living today, all of them, if they are the mayor of a city in France, they are used for 40 years to have these discussions where each time they renew their contract, they have on one end the Veolia bid, on the other end the SUEZ bid. So I get that they might be neutral because Meridiam might be taking over Suez, so that competition might remain somehow unchanged. But I don't see why they would be in favor of this merger. But what's the actual power of the politicians? It's said that one of them in particular could be a key deciding guy, which is André Santini, as the head of the biggest utility in France, or the biggest municipal utility with the SEDIF. What do you think? Does one of them really have the power to do something?
So, I mean, it depends which politicians you're talking about. The politicians that have concrete power at this stage are the people in government at the national level. So the ministers, essentially, and to a lesser extent, the parliamentary majority. But, I mean, with the current, we don't need to get into the details of French politics, but, the parliamentary majority at this point is basically just a rubber stamp for the government. So, because the government, the French state, has a 23.6% stake in ENGIE, and they have a third of voting rights on the board of directors at ENGIE. So they can very concretely say yes or no to an offer that's being presented to ENGIE. So that's very important. Local elected officials, on the other hand, don't have any direct power at all. And they have, I would say, limited influence. There's quite a few kind of individual mayors that have come out in the press and signed, open letters and things like that, saying that they don't want reduced competition in the marketplace. But the actual association of mayors has published a press release saying that they would remain officially neutral, which in effect, whatever their intentions, in effect is in favor of VEOLIA because it removes an obstacle that was otherwise expected. And I think that might have something to do with the fact that the president of the Mayors Association, who is a man called François Barouin, who used to be a fairly important minister, he is employed by Barclays to advise the French government on this very transaction. And so I think that's why he was kind of forced into putting out a statement of neutrality for the association.
Which, by the way, it's an incredible sign of how much the stars align for VEOLIA, because ENGIE wants to sell. ENGIE has kind of a crisis of governance. SUEZ is not in a strong position right now to find a white knight. And the political association is a bit binded by the fact that the president of that association cannot, due to maybe possible conflict of interest, he's not allowed to take a strong position on that. So that makes a good opportunity for VEOLIA.
For sure. I mean, the political context is broadly kind of incredibly favorable to VEOLIA in general. But then, so the people who really matter at this point, the person who really matters at this point is the Minister of the Economy. Because after kind of initial confusion where you had different ministers speaking in a kind of uncoordinated fashion about this, we talked about the Prime Minister speaking kind of off the cuff at a press conference that had nothing to do with this, but he was just asked by a journalist about this. And then you had the Labour Minister going on television, again, I think to talk about something different. And at some point she was asked about this deal. And, she said that there was no threat to employment anyway, which I think is debatable. So those kind of initial signals were kind of all over the place and mostly in favor of VEOLIA. And then the economy minister kind of reined everybody in, very likely said at some point, I'm the only one who's going to be speaking about this from now on, which has been the case. And he has tried to strike a tone of neutrality and saying, we need more time. What matters to us are this, and this, employment, French capital. And the fact that this shouldn't be a kind of forced marriage to an extent, that's been an interesting kind of new variable that he's introduced into the mix.
But so at best, what could happen is that his intervention might buy SUEZ a little bit of time to prepare a new argumentation. And when you look at what they were doing over the past weeks, they had this deal which was already signed before of selling OSIS to VEOLIA for 300 million. And they just announced, which was also scheduled, but I have the feeling it was a bit rushed, that they are now selling for 1.1 billion of assets in Germany, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and Poland in the waste sector.
Yeah, and they've added Sweden to that list since then as well.
Okay, so basically they are a bit speeding up their process of selling non-core assets, having this asset rotation program, which means they have free cash, which is a nice opportunity maybe to buy back their shares, or which is also a way to appeal to a potential investor to see, look, we have available cash, which shows that we are not a dead horse. But on the other end, it's also giving an interesting argument to Antoine Frérot, which is saying by now they've sold 13,000 of their 90,000 people working. So if you just give them some more time, who knows what's going to be left in SUEZ by December. So what do they exactly intend to achieve with this the sales of assets?
The thing you have to bear in mind, first of all, and I think this is something that Veolia's PR machine is very deliberately ignoring, is the fact that SUEZ had been planning for a while to sell between 3 and 4 billion euros in assets between 2019 and 2023, right? And by the way, Veolia has an equivalent plan on their side as well, which has been in place, I think, since 2019 as well, or maybe 2018. This predates the acquisition offer. SUEZ has been accelerating it in response to the acquisition offer. I don't think it's because they intend to buy back their own shares, certainly not all of them. I mean, they don't have the money to do it. For a start, they're starting to accelerate this process, but by the time the cash comes in, it will be too late, and they're certainly not going to get the 3 billion immediately or anywhere near quick enough. But what their strategy is, and you can see that in their press release and in the language that they're using, is that they want, exactly as you said, to kind of show their shareholders and any potential future shareholder, investor, that they are in a position to generate value for them. And that's why they announced that, the proceeds from those sales would be very largely redistributed to shareholders, which again, Veolia has been using against SUEZ in a PR battle, basically saying, playing outrage and saying, oh, how dare they, distribute an extra billion euros to their shareholders in the middle of the pandemic, kind of riding the political wave of demonizing shareholders, which always pays off in French politics, but is very ironic coming from Veolia because they're
doing that for the past 20 years.
Exactly. They've been very good at making sure that their shareholders are happy. And I mean, if you look at even the share performance in the stock markets of Veolia versus SUEZ over the past 10 years, Veolia has consistently outperformed SUEZ because they've made sure that their dividends are steadily rising, whereas SUEZ's dividend has been the same for years and years. So I think it's very disingenuous of them. But to go back to your main point, I think the point of this acceleration of the asset sale, which again is in reaction to Veolia's attempt at takeover, is more to promise value to investors and maybe to participate in the share buybacks, but to, as a kind of minority, rather than just to generate enough cash to buy all of NG's 32%, because they're not going to be able to do that anyway.
So if the intention is to increase the confidence of a potential investor, isn't it kind of a strange initiative to be so supportive to the unions and to even foster the reactions of the union with this Always SUEZ campaign, with the strikes in France, saying that out of these synergies that Veolia is seeing in the merger, a part of it has going to be down the line that some jobs are going to be just lost in the merger. So it's kind of a double take. On one end, you try to please your shareholders so that they get more eager to invest in the company. But on the other end, you are playing with the unions, which we know is anyways the image of France. So is that double game extremely clever or extremely risky?
I mean, I don't think they have much of a choice, is the thing. Right now, Suez doesn't have many allies, and it's grabbing allies anywhere it can. And the unions were always going to be opposed to a merger, and management knows it, and they're very glad that they're drumming up support, for an alternative plan. It also plays into their hand that of basically saying, no one at Suez wants this. The company cultures are very different, etc., which Veolia has countered with some valid argument, I think, including using the example of SUEZ precisely, which was sold to Veolia very, very recently. And, in the 2 weeks that passed, really, between the closing of that sale, the announcement of that sale, I should say, and the announcement of Veolia's takeover attempt, the management at Suez was saying to the teams at SUEZ, you'll be very happy at Veolia. Don't worry about it. They have a very similar culture. It's not going to be a problem for you. And then 2 weeks later, they completely changed tack, and suddenly, they're saying to all Suez employees, Veolia is the enemy. I think that's a fair point that Antoine Frérot is raising, that there's this kind of double standard, but it's also to be expected that, Suez would fight back using any allies that it finds, including the unions.
Now, if we go back to the tactics that they are playing those days, still, if you bear in mind that they want to have the favors of the French government, which might be an ally if they can win some time there. Isn't it curious, the move that they made to take Suez water in France and to put it in a foundation under the right of the Netherlands, which it's a clever tactics in the sense that the foundation in the Netherlands are pretty strong. And we have seen with, I think it was ArcelorMittal, when there was this battle between the two big ones that used the same tactics. I mean, Arcelor used the same tactics. So it's proven to have some strength. But if you take, again, your critical eye and you say they are taking their asset, which they pretend to be key and that they don't want to harm at all, and they put it in kind of a fiscal paradise one way or the other, and they protect it under the protection of a foreign state, of course, in the European Union as well. But still, isn't it also a strange move? And is it really a move that can block the full situation? Because Veolia could also sell out their own water business. And if they take over fully Suez, they will also take over that foundation.
Yes. So first of all, there's quite a lot of misinformation circulating about this thing. And I think the blame partly rests on Suez because their initial press release was not very clear and was very easy to kind of be mistaken.
Okay.
What they actually did was create a foundation under Dutch law, because it's a lot easier and a lot quicker to create a foundation under Dutch law than it is to create one in France. And then they transferred one share from Suez Waterfront to that foundation and one share from another subsidiary that they didn't name, which is also impacted by the waterfront's activity. I would imagine it's probably De Grémont France or something like that. The foundation holds 2 shares of those subsidiary companies out of, for Suez Waterfront, it's 42 million shares. So the ownership of the subsidiary has not been transferred to the Netherlands at all. The ownership of the subsidiary remains, to 99.9% in the hands of Suez SA, which is, a French company. But the way that the subsidiary companies are structured, they're not an SA. I mean, if we want to go into kind of the specifics of the French company law, they're not a société anonyme. They are a société par action simplifiée. And so that means that a lot of the internal governance of those SAS, as they're called, is left up to their own statutes. And so the way that Suez has written those statutes, it means that even if you hold a single share, you have veto power over things like acquisitions and sales and things like that. So it means that with a transfer of, a completely negligible amount of ownership, of actual ownership, it gives the foundation veto power. And the foundation is under Dutch law, but the people actually running the foundation are going to be one Dutch lawyer and one employee representative of Suez and one former employee representative of Suez. So there's no transfer of assets to a tax haven at all. It has absolutely no bearing on anything to do with taxes or ownership. It's really just a question of control. So that's the one thing. Then on whether it matters or not. I think it was a very clever tactical move because it certainly makes Veolia's job harder because basically it forces them to sell off some other Veolia's own water activities, essentially, or at least some of them, in order to comply with the antitrust legislation, which they're really not happy with the idea of doing that. But it's not going to change the outcome fully. It's only a tactical move, really, because SUEZ is fighting a rearguard battle at the moment. They've talked to every single investor that they could find. So far, they have found no one who would commit to being on their side and to mounting a counteroffer. So this is essentially stalling for time and kind of, again, making Veolia's life more difficult. Actually, Antoine Frérot has said that Veolia's lawyers had found a way around it. He didn't say what that was. Maybe we'll know more by the time this goes out. I don't know. It's a very clever move, but it's only a tactical move. It's not going to change the outcome realistically.
So let's take a minute to talk about the investors on the other side. We've seen that there's not much people on the side of SUEZ, but there's this one investment group which is on the side of Veolia, which is Meridiam. Meridiam tried in the past to acquire SOR, and they didn't succeed in that, but they seem to be consistent with their willingness to enter the water sector, and they would be acquiring SUEZ Eau France, or maybe now Veolia Water France, but they would be acquiring the part which for antitrust policies has to go out of the merged group if the merger happens. With the scenario which was on air so far, they would acquire SUEZ Water France, also a bit of the Circe, I guess, so some research, and maybe a bit of De Grémont, so they might be also able to build stuff. But still, the big strength of SUEZ so far was that they were able, as you said previously, they were able to commission a plan from A to Z, to plan everything, to build everything, to have everything in-house, to operate everything in-house. And now that little chunk of SUEZ in France wouldn't have this full array of assets. They wouldn't have SUEZ WTS providing the equipment. They wouldn't have maybe a part of the digital line and the digital solutions of SUEZ. So does Meridiam see something out there that we don't see, and they really think that they can gain a competitive edge and become better and preserve their market share? Or is it kind of a clever move from Veolia to say, well, we sell you that, but over the next 20 years, as soon as a contract is up for renewal, we're going to buy back the share that you are buying right now?
It's a difficult one, isn't it? To be honest, I'm not entirely sure what Meridiam's vision is. They've pledged to invest massively in French infrastructure, which is a laudable intention. And they've pledged to keep all of the employees. Obviously, they would be inheriting the existing contracts. But in terms of the competitiveness, it's a tough one because, as you say, SUEZ Water France on its own would be cut off from all the engines of innovation within SUEZ at the moment. They wouldn't have WTS because that's based in the US. They wouldn't have, realistically, SUEZ Advanced Solutions, which is the kind of driving force of their digital innovation at the moment. Because really, Veolia would be foolish to let that go. It's probably one of the big reasons why they want to acquire SUEZ in the first place. It would be very strange for them to sell that back to Meridiam alongside with SUEZ Eau France. And, during the parliamentary hearings last week, Bertrand Camus actually said, De Grémont France on its own is not profitable. It runs at a loss every single year. It's only profitable at the global level because you have kind of cross-pollination.
And not even every year, because when they had the big contract in Melbourne and the big troubles associated, really, De Grémont France was, De Grémont as a whole company was in trouble, but it makes sense from an industrial point of view to be part of SUEZ.
Yeah, that's the hazards of the projects market, really. But if you take a kind of long-term view, De Grémont is profitable at a global level, but it's never profitable just in France. That's the thing. And again, even as just an operator, it's difficult to see what SUEZ could offer municipal clients in future when it comes to renewing existing contracts or bidding for new contracts, of course, if they're cut off from all of the worldwide innovation. Because I mean, to me, the main reason why SUEZ and VEOLIA have been such good competitors on the French market so far is precisely because they have the same sort of structure. They're both global groups that have access to global resources and global innovation. And that's why they have, if you compare that to SOR, for example, which has started expanding internationally relatively recently within the past, decade or two, and is only now starting to really expand their technology offering. They're really far behind even on the French market, even though SOR has, decades of experience as an operator in French municipal contracts, just like SUEZ, just like VEOLIA, but they don't have that competitive edge of a global innovation network. And so if tomorrow Meridiam owns basically a new Lyonnaise des Eaux without any of the global innovation, I don't think they'll have much of a competitive offering to bring to the table for their clients. The one thing that Meridiam seems to be counting on, and which might work, is access to capital. Because the thing about having a big group which is, publicly traded, is that shareholders always push for saving costs and not taking risks, etc., and not putting down money for investment, or as little as possible, because that's extra risk. Whereas Meridiam, as a long-term investor, would be in a position to, and by all accounts has the intention to put down very large amounts of money for investments in the networks. And so that could play in its favor. But I think they're overestimating the extent to which that investment would be easy to deploy. Because the thing about the municipal market in France is that there's actually fairly few full concessions. And it's only when you have a full concession that investment, capital expenditure, is fully up to the private partner. If you have an affermage, which is the more common type of contract, or just kind of normal operations and maintenance contract, then the investment is left up to the city or the agglomération, the métropole, the public partner. They're still responsible for investment, even when a private partner is operating. And if Meridiam intends to renegotiate contracts to turn them, for example, from an affermage into a concession so that they can invest more, which of course would be beneficial to the public partner as well, that has the political downside of making it so that the private partner becomes the legal owner of the assets. And of course, that can be, politically tricky.
I think that was one of the defensors of SUEZ, which is Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who wrote that he's fully in favor of the fact that they remain separated, but he also wants to dismantle those groups and to take all the employees back to the municipalities, and they would be working in the municipalities and doing everything themselves, 100% municipal.
Well, of course, and Philippe Martinez has said the same thing. But, they're not the ones that are going to.
It's not going to happen anytime soon. But yeah. Nevertheless, the trend is there. So it's difficult to say that there's going to be this shift. And actually, I was reading an interview from Estelle Brackenhoff, which is the number 2 of VEOLIA, and she gave 2 facts that to me were opening new questions. She says that Meridiam was going to invest 800 millions, and I don't see in what. And the other thing is, she also said that Meridiam might not limit themselves to France, that once they have this knowledge, they're going to build SUEZ back as a phoenix, and SUEZ Water France might become SUEZ Water and then SUEZ and be a competitor to the new merger of VEOLIA and SUEZ. So it's like a worm. You cook the worm in 2 and you have 2 worms.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds to me, the second part of this sounds to me like wishful thinking. The 800 million is the figure that Meridiam themselves have been, floating all around. So that is very much, at least their intention. Again, whether they'll be able to do it is another thing. But going international from the basis of SUEZ Water France is not something that Thierry Dehau, the CEO of Meridiam, has talked about himself, at least not publicly. And, it sounds like, to me, I haven't actually read this interview, so I'm reacting kind of in real time here. But I would say my instinct is to think that this is meant to appease, politicians and regulators and have them think, no, don't worry, it'll all be fine. There's no threat to competition, either in France or abroad. It's all going to be fine. It's certainly a possibility. I'm not saying that it's never going to happen, but it's definitely not going to happen in the short term. It's going to take a lot of time if it happens. And there is, a very real possibility that it might not happen as well.
Mm-hmm. Actually, in that interview, she also mentioned another point, which is also an open question to me. Veolia is mentioning that they intend to do 500 millions of synergies and economies, and this without cutting one single job. So on one end, if I was working for SUEZ in the CB21 in Paris, I would be concerned, because I guess that maybe in the assets out there in the world, you cannot from one day to another cut jobs. But from the corporate end, I don't see why you would have two corporates. But that's one first question. The second thing is she was explaining in the interview that where the 500 million would come from is that there are operational synergies. Like she said that in the UK, the assets that Veolia have 93% availability when SUEZ only has 88% availability, which means that if you take the good practices from Veolia and you transfer them to SUEZ, you're going to win this 5% availability on the assets, and that's going to make 13 millions. And she also said that the wastewater treatment plants, on the other hand, are better operated by SUEZ than they are by Veolia. So once again, if you take the best practices and you transfer it from SUEZ to Veolia, you're going to improve globally. So that sounds absolutely nice on the paper, but how adding up all those little savings, if you can reach them at all, how do you achieve the 500 millions? And do you really believe that no jobs are on the line?
What you have to bear in mind is that this 500 million figure, they announced that from the very start. From the very start of the announcement of their operation, they said we are going to make 500 million in cost synergies on top of the 1 billion savings program that each of the two companies has. So, SUEZ has this SUEZ 2030 plan that I've mentioned without saying the name before, that says we're going to cut €1 billion in costs by 2023. Veolia has a plan called Impact 2023, which says pretty much exactly the same thing. So each of the two companies was always supposed to save 1 billion on its own. So that's 2 billion. And Veolia is saying on top of that, they'll save 500 million. So that's 2.5 billion euros saved by 2023. You can optimize the way a wastewater treatment plant works all you like. You can't achieve 2.5 billion euros in savings without cutting at least some salaries. It sounds completely outlandish to me. Obviously what this course has been focusing on is that the people on the ground are employed as part of contracts with the municipalities, which is, of course, absolutely true. And so there's no reason to think that, the people actually running utilities, be it water, wastewater, or solid waste utilities, are going to lose their job. They are, by, all reckoning, going to be safe. But as you said, the question is for the corporate jobs. And there are thousands of them in France and abroad. And I find it very hard to believe that Veolia could achieve its target of savings and lose not a single job at the same time. That seems very, very unlikely to me.
Actually, it's pretty funny that the wastewater treatment plant come as an example, because the first cost by far on the wastewater treatment plant is personal cost. When you say you try to optimize things on a wastewater treatment plant, it's hard to believe that it's not touching the jobs. Of course, it's not on the short term, but on the long run, the synergies are going to come from automation or whatever could. It's another debate, which I don't want to enter right now. But I was quite surprised to see that that's the prime argument. We're going to cut costs because we are becoming so much better. But by the way, I saw that SUEZ now is not aiming for 1 billion, but 1.2 billion. So I think if they keep winning some time from the government somewhere down the line, they're going to find themselves those synergies. the numbers can be made up? Who's going to verify that? So I know I'm being a bit sarcastic, but it's a bit those big numbers.
Well, hopefully GWI is going to verify it, but it'll be, after the fact. So, no, but it's complicated because I don't know. I think we've said as much as we can on this. Maybe just one thing just to say that SUEZ management, and in particular Jean-Marc Boursier, who's the COO of the group and also the head of SUEZ Water France, he has said that SUEZ thinks that there's 10,000 jobs on the line, including 4,000 in France. Now, I think that is a bit exaggerated because those numbers, and SUEZ has said it themselves, those numbers come from estimates that were made back in 2012 when the merger was initially kind of explored. Back in 2012, there was no talk of selling off SUEZ Water France to, anyone like Meridiam or anything. So those job losses would have included a lot of mashing together of the two corporates and then kind of functioning on the ground in France, which is not, even if Veolia gets their way, is not going to happen this time. So I think that SUEZ's prediction for job losses is a bit exaggerated. But on the other hand, Veolia's promise that there'll be absolutely zero loss of jobs seems completely unrealistic to me.
So, Sebastien, I have to be a bit cautious of your time at some point. And it's a fascinating topic to me. So I could be keeping asking questions for half an hour or an hour pretty easily. But I think it's a drama. So assuming that today is not the last day and that there might be a new offer or a new something, I'm pretty sure that somewhere in the future, we might be able to comment on a new element of that drama. So if you don't mind, just I have a last one. And maybe if you appreciated the exercise, I would be very happy to re-invite you on that microphone to speak about that same drama a bit later. But you mentioned that, just bought Neuhaus, that Dupont is buying several companies that, when you go on GWI, let me do some advertising. If you go on GWI Water Data and you have a look at your specific section about the merger and acquisition, it's just never ending. There's something new every week. I think the last one was Aliaxis buying Kendu. There's several ones. What is happening in the water sector? Is it something which is really punctual right now because of the COVID, or does it have absolutely nothing to do and that was going to happen anyways because having the two biggest companies in the world representing 5% of the world market shows that the market is so fragmented that it has to consolidate at some point?
That is a very, very...
That was a very broad question for...
And, I think the one thing I can say in a short amount of time is that I don't think it's particularly to do with COVID. Perhaps COVID has accelerated some things. It has certainly slowed down many things. So I don't think it's anything to do particularly with COVID. If you look at, the reasons why this whole Veolia SUEZ business emerged in the first place, it's because ENGIE is reorienting towards its core business, which is energy. And that doesn't really come from COVID at all. In order to give not just about an answer, not just about what it is not, but about what it is, I think you could dedicate an entire other podcast episode about this. And maybe you might want to speak to someone who has a more global view of this than I do, because I remain fairly focused on Europe. And I think that to give a properly thorough answer to your question, a global view would be needed.
So let me suggest you to keep this idea in a part of your brain right now. And that could come back in a couple of minutes, because I propose you to switch to the rapid fire questions. And actually, my last question could be an opportunity for you to recommend me someone to to take on this discussion. But no spoiler.
It's time for the rapid fire questions.
Let me start from the first one. What is the most exciting project you've been working on and why? Maybe that doesn't apply fully to your profile, but let's see what your take is on this one.
Well, so I guess it all depends what you mean by project, right? The projects that I'm involved in are of a very different kind from what it is for most of your guests, since my project's mostly involved in researching and writing. I remember one particular article for the magazine, which was a lot of fun to put together, not only because I got to travel to a city that I didn't know before, the city of Aarhus in Denmark, which is a very lovely place. But also because it was about the very start of the procurement process for a new wastewater treatment plant, which aims to be the most innovative wastewater treatment plant in the world. And so it aims to have a modular structure so that you can kind of update it as you go along with the latest technologies, test some technologies directly on it, and have full resource recovery. It's a very interesting project. It's supposed to start operations in 2026, so it's still in the early stages, but it's something I've been keeping an eye on, and I'm quite looking forward to seeing where it goes.
This kind of investigation, is it the favorite part of your current job, or would you have something else to mention?
I know that's what everybody says, but really the people I work with are the favorite part of my job. GWI has a really diverse bunch of people all working together from all over the world, which is, to me, it's the environment that I prefer, really. During my studies, I studied in quite a few different countries, and the very last year of my studies, I was just with French people, and I didn't like it very much. So having people coming from all over the world, kind of coming together and sharing all sorts of different perspectives, obviously on what we do at work, but also on whatever we happen to be talking about during the lunch break, is a really fantastic part of the job.
Well, actually, my next question is really something which was made and written for you. What is the trend to watch out for in the water industry?
Yeah, that is very much my job to answer that, indeed. Well, I can only speak to what's going on in Europe, but I would say sludge management really is the next big thing in the water sector, and especially, of course, in the wastewater subsector, because there's kind of a chain of reasons why. At the start of it really is the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive from the EU, which mandates, since the 90s, has mandated that all cities that are above 10,000 population equivalent should remove nitrogen and phosphorus. That means that most wastewater treatment plants now have some sort of biological removal process, which means that they're generating a lot more sewage sludge than was the case before the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive came into force. Now, historically, that sludge has been, in really the olden days, it used to be landfilled. That is now very much, going downhill. But there's also a lot of spreading to agriculture. But that is starting to see some problems with fears of contamination from pollutants, which are sometimes founded, sometimes less so. But it means that there's a reluctance to spread and a push towards phosphorus recovery or nutrient recovery more broadly from the sludge, so that you can get the nutrients without having the rest of the sludge, basically. And so you can use that as fertilizer in fields. That is in some kind of key countries like Germany, Switzerland. Sweden is kind of inching towards it, but it's not quite certain whether they'll make a law about it. It's likely that the next Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, which is in the process of just starting to be revised, will touch upon this as well. And whether or not you have this drive for phosphorus recovery, there is a need everywhere for volume reduction of sludge, be it, drying, dewatering, all of that stuff, for the very simple reason that, the less water you have inside the sludge, the less it costs to run a truck to transport it between places. And then there's the final thing about sludge, really, which is biogas production, which is technologically a very easy way to get energy out of the sludge at the same time as you reduce the volume through anaerobic digestion. And that's a kind of easy win for utilities to reduce their carbon footprint, for example.
I think that was the most extensive and to the other end, the most interesting answer to that question since I'm asking it. So thanks a lot for that. And it's the first time that someone mentions sludge here. I had once someone mentioning the project of the digester in Strasbourg, the injection of the biogas in the network. But it's a fascinating topic for sure. The next one is going to be, I guess, more tricky for you because what is the thing you care the most when you're working on your new project? And on the other end, what is the one you care the less?
Right. So again, for me, every article is a new project in itself. So I'll try to to talk about articles. And when I start researching an article, what matters most to me really is getting to the bottom of what's going on. There's quite a few business publications out there, not just about water, but about many different topics that basically earn a living by rephrasing or sometimes straight copying press releases. That's not what we do at GWI. What we aim to do is to give actual insight into what the news is and what it means. It's all about getting to the bottom of what's going on. And I would say the corollary of that is that the thing I care least about when writing an article is how it makes, company A or company B look. That's not my concern.
Do you have sources to recommend to keep up with the water and wastewater market trends? And this one is extremely interesting to me because everyone answers GWI to that question. But what is the source of the source?
Well, first of all, to your listeners, I'm definitely going to recommend GWI magazine to keep up with the news and GWI water data to kind of have the broader overview of market dynamics and then market access, market metrics, all of that. In terms of the sources we look at, well, there's a lot of scouring of all sorts of various publications. The regional press is a surprising goldmine sometimes to keep up with individual projects, but really the core of our added value is that we talk to people. We talk to the people who are actually involved in the projects, in the stories, and we try to get their insight. And so that's what makes the added value of GWI, is that what you will get in GWI, you won't get from just reading what we read, because you would also have to talk to the people we talk to.
That's a very good one. So now I come back to the answer that I asked you to save previously, which is, would you have someone to recommend that we should definitely invite to that same microphone as soon as possible, and maybe to discuss this trend of consolidation within the water sector?
Well, I think, many of my colleagues would make great guests on your show because, again, there's all sorts of specializations within GWI. And I know a lot about the European market, but there's a lot of topics that I know not very much about, but my colleagues know a hell of a lot about. And so, depending on the topic you want to touch upon, there's a variety of people that I could recommend you. I think on the kind of big picture, the people that are heading our editorial team, such as, Ian Elkins or Christopher Gasson would be very interesting to talk to potentially, if they have the time, because they are very busy people.
So I'll take my chance. Well, as I said, we just addressed a drama which might end today, or which might, let me take a bet, not end today. So if you have some time for me down the line, maybe we can have a follow-up episode where we sort that out once everything is settled and whether the merger happens or doesn't happen. So I don't know if you would be interested, but on my end, that would be for sure interesting to talk with you again.
Yes, I'd love to. I'm definitely going to keep following what's going on. If I may hazard a prognosis at this point, it's, there are obstacles to VEOLIA getting what it wants, but ultimately the fact remains that they're the only ones who've submitted an offer. And SUEZ doesn't look like it's going to submit an alternative offer. So it looks like VEOLIA is probably going to get their way in the end, kind of by default. And personally, for all the reasons that we've talked about, mostly to do with competition at a global level and also the implications that lack of competition has on innovation, I think that's bad news for the water market, but it might be inevitable at this point. We'll see. Maybe when I come back, you will tell me that I've been completely wrong.
Well, I share your impression. So if I was to make a bet today, I would be doing the same bet. So I propose you to take both our bets, we put them in the fridge, and we just have a discussion over them when all of that settles down.
That sounds good.
Thanks a lot, Sebastien. You've been an awesome guest. And
thank you for having me.
Talk to you soon.
I certainly hope so.
Thanks for listening to Don't Waste Water. This podcast was brought to you by GF Piping Systems. Loved this episode? Head over to Apple Podcasts to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. See you next time.